Iris. So thank you everybody for being here. And this is the inaugural webinar of ASE. And I wanted to, first of all, I want to thank Iris Buddha for agreeing to be our seminar coordinator this year, who is putting together a series of seminars that are likely to be monthly. She's from Idaho State, and we really appreciate the work that she's doing. I also wanted to introduce this webinar and what led to this. And the events were really two. One was the murder of George Floyd last year, which I believe caused ASE, the Association for Social Economics, to really reckon with its role and its obligations and abilities as an intellectual and academic organization to contribute to understanding issues of race and racism in the United States and globally. And the second event was the insurrection on January 6th. And in that regard, I'd like to read you a portion of the statement that the ASE issued at that time that really situates this seminar and describes what we have hoped to attain. And so I'm going to read it. It says, feeling the weight of this moment, we, the leadership of ASE, write to you today to comment on the recent assault on the US Capitol building. It is time for clear talk. This insurrection and act of terror, inspired by the president and his enablers, along with the inadequate preparation and response, laid bare the vivid racism that defines US society. This racism is especially stark when juxtaposed against with the public response to the legitimate outrage and Black Lives Matter protests of the unlawful shootings and killings of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Jacob Blake, Ahmaud Arbery, and others. And it is even more stark when we consider that in 2013, a young Black woman, Miriam Carey, was shot and killed by the Capitol Police for merely making a U-turn at a checkpoint on the Capitol grounds. We as economists and social scientists are well positioned to use our craft and talents to investigate the incentives and disincentives to weaponize the police and whole security apparatus in the immoral devaluation of human beings on the basis of something as cursory as a social identity like race. Moreover, moreover, we have an obligation to use our talents to craft policy and alternative structures that rightly use the institutions of government to reckon with our past and present and plot pathways forward that ensure we all have basic needs met and can live with dignity and economic security. And we have signed this in solidarity with those who have suffered at the hands of the police, who have been persistently marginalized in our economies and societies, and those who deeply desire to commit to a society with economic inclusion for everyone. That was our statement, and that has been our commitment in the coming year, and I hope in the coming years, is to really act on that commitment. And this webinar and the series of webinars is a step in that direction. And one of the areas in particular that we were interested in investigating was also state-sponsored violence. So I want to thank Iris again for putting this together, and very grateful to our two speakers, and I turn it over to Iris. Thanks a lot.
Well, thank you so much, Stephanie, and for providing us this opportunity to have these important webinar sessions. And of course, my gratitude goes out to Dr. William Oliver, one of our panelists, as well as Ayana, Bess, another one of our panelists. I cannot thank you enough in advance for discussing these important elements. So before we have them present, I will provide a brief introduction of our panelists. Then we'll have each present either 30 to 45 minutes, depending on their preference. I will give a 5-minute warning and then a 2-minute warning if we near that 45-minute mark. And then we'll follow up with a Q&A session. So our first presenter is Dr. William Oliver, who is an associate professor emeritus in the Department of Criminal Justice at Indiana University. His primary area of research examines the social context and interpersonal dynamics associated with violent confrontations among African Americans. His book, The Violent Social Work of Black Men, has been praised for its revealing analysis of the interpersonal and situational dynamics of violent confrontations that occur among Black men in street corner social settings. Dr. Oliver has also conducted research with prisoners examining the impact of incarceration on relationships between incarcerated men and their female partners. In addition, he has conducted research examining turning points in the life course of incarcerated violent offenders in Bermuda. His most recent his most recent research examines prisoner reentry in majority Black rural counties in the South, how incarcerated men maintain relationships with their children during and following a period of incarceration. For 12 years, Professor Oliver served as a member of the steering committee of the Institute on Domestic Violence in the African American Community, University of Minnesota. Prior to beginning his academic career, Oliver held positions as a policy analyst with both the New York State Commission on Corrections and the New York State Division of Criminal Justice Services. Oliver received his BS in Political Science from Tuskegee University and his master's and PhD in Criminal Justice from the School of Criminal Justice at the State University of New York at Albany. So thank you, Dr. Oliver. And then our second panelist, Ayana Best, is a doctoral candidate in the Political Science and International Relations Department at the University of Southern California. Her research primarily focuses on the effects of state-sponsored violence on Black women's political participation and civic engagement. She argues that Black women possess a stronger sense of a collective consciousness through their shared experiences and are more likely to mobilize against police violence because of the threat it poses to themselves and, more importantly, to their loved ones. Ayana earned her BA in Political Science from the University of California, Riverside. She previously held a research position at the USC Center for Feminist Research, working on projects addressing homelessness for women of color in California, and is currently working with the California Black Redistricting Hub, providing policy analysts that inform strategic priorities and planning related to redistricting the Black community. So without further ado, I will turn this over to Dr. William Oliver for our first presentation.
Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you, Professor Buder, for inviting me to this webinar. I'll try not to be too long-winded. My goal today is to share a framework that I use and some concepts that help me inform my research interests, especially as it relates to violence among African Americans. My primary interest is not state violence. My primary interest is interpersonal violence that occurs in street corner settings. But it's impossible, or one should be aware of the larger structural context in which situational events occur. And as a result of that, I've always been interested in, to be frank, the interrelationship between structure, culture, particularly problematic cultural adaptations to structural pressures, and then situational events that culminate in violence. For my presentation today, I'm referencing primarily two sources. I'm referencing a paper I published in 2001. It's called Cultural Racism and Structural Violence, Implications for African Americans. It was published in the Journal of Human Behavior and the Social Environment, Volume 4. And I'm also referencing the work of some professors at Indiana University, Fort Wayne, Peter Iadacola and Anson Shoup. They have a third edition. I probably cited something earlier than that. This book is titled Violence, Inequality, and Human Freedom. And they are the ones who really developed this framework that I'm going to use, but I applied it to African Americans and they were using it in a more generic sense. And I want to say something about teaching race. Throughout my academic career in the classroom, especially, I have taught classes on race, classes like social problems in the Black community, my signature course, violence in the Black community, domestic violence, prisons and prisoners, and unequal justice. The unequal justice course is most related to some of the police violence topics that are prevalent in the news today. In that course, we addressed racial profiling, mass incarceration, and police violence. And one of the things I wanted to make reference to is that it's my view that when addressing issues related to race and racial challenges, racial conflict, that discussion be placed in some type of historical context. And so when I just address issues of race, one of the things that I do early on in my courses is I introduce students to something that I refer to as the African-American timeline. And depending upon your sensibilities, you might just call it the American timeline. But I call it the African-American timeline because I'm trying to center and frame the presence of African-Americans in America and their particular challenges. And so in my timeline, what I present to the students is the 1619 to 1865, about 246 years, status of most Black people in America, slaves, property of other people, and a system that supported their subordination. Then we have 1865 to, I use 1968. Some people might want to use 1954. I use 1968 primarily because that is when we have the passage of the last of the great civil rights acts. So overt racial discrimination as practiced under Jim Crow is at least legally dismantled with the 1968 Civil Rights Act. So now we have another 100 years of racial discrimination. However, we have to be fair. As I indicated earlier before the presentation, I grew up in upstate New York, born and raised, born in 1953. I did not experience any overt racial discrimination growing up where I grew up. I went to integrated schools, all that, but I'm first generation born in the North to Southerners. And Southerners like to go home to see Big Mama and them. And so I'm going to Alabama. I'm going to Georgia as a 6-year-old, an 8-year-old, a 12-year-old, and I'm seeing straight up racial discrimination. But it's not my reality. But I use 1968 primarily because it's a very signature point in our evolution as a country with regard to trying to establish a foundation for the citizenship of African Americans and then others who benefited from those rights. And so going up with my timeline, and I'm toward the end of that, 1968, 2021, about 53 years. I call this in my time the era of first-class citizenship. So you got African Americans in the country 400 years with roughly 50 years plus of first-class citizenship throughout the country. And why this is important to me is to begin to frame and center the experience of African Americans before we start addressing other issues, whatever I was teaching at any given time. Now, what about the consequences of this timeline? Well, this timeline has some significant consequences, and mainly consequences in the form of racial disparities in education, vocational training, the accumulation of wealth, disparities in political participation, and a host of social problems that have to do with poverty and family disruption. That 350 years of racial oppression has significant consequences that continue to resonate in 2021 as part of the American heritage and the specific experience of African Americans. The other thing that I like to do when I'm teaching a course that has a lot of racial content, and all of my courses, I don't care what I'm talking about, it's going to have some racial content. I'm going to have articles, I'm going to have chapters. I'm going to, if I'm teaching a course on domestic violence, I'm going to have a whole segment on domestic violence among African Americans, domestic violence among Latinos, domestic violence among Asians, domestic violence among the GLBTQ community. I'm going to have a lot of diversity in my course content intentionally. Okay, but there's a pedagogical question, that needs to be posed, or that I pose to myself. How do I teach about racism and racial oppression without scaring the hell out of my white students or turning them off? Okay, how do I do that? And then if you walk in the classroom and you're a Black man and you're kind of passionate and you're a little rough around the edges, not as refined as some of your colleagues, it can be problematic. The Black man talking about race, he's talking about racial discrimination, racial oppression. Is he talking about me and my people? How do you do that? And what I have done over the years is a couple of things to try to establish some civility and comfort in my classrooms. The first thing I do is I model something that was presented to me when I was a young undergraduate at a historically Black college in Alabama, Tuskegee Institute. And that is, I model respect. Now, I know for younger generation professors, they may not go to the extreme that I went to. When I was an undergraduate in the early 1970s, my professors always called me Mr. Oliver. At Indiana University, University of Delaware, I always address my students as Mr. or Miss. I'm trying to convey to them, I respect you. I respect you. And then I have high expectations. I want you to do well. I'm setting the bar high, right? But that respect is key. Then I say to them early on in the class, discussing issues of race make people feel uncomfortable. You may feel uncomfortable, but we're going to have mutual respect for one another and each other's opinion in here. Okay, and then I also tried to early on illustrate some fundamental, persistent disparities. And given that I'm a criminologist, one of the disparities I like to focus on in my courses is disparities in arrests. So for example, in 2019, nearly 6.5 million people were arrested. And 70% of those people were white. There are only 2 crimes in which Black people represent 50% or more of the people arrested. They are robbery and they're murder. Every other crime, whether we're talking about drug trafficking, embezzlement, prostitution, aggravated assault, rape, majority white. Okay. But even when Blacks are represented as less than a majority, they're disproportionately represented. So for example, in 2019, Blacks were 26% of persons who were arrested, nearly 2 times their 13% representation in the general population. That is important to know. And so one of the ironies is, if whites are the majority of the persons who are committing these crimes, why aren't their communities policed consistent with their criminal involvement? Got to raise that Arsenio Hall kind of question, something that makes you say, what's going on here? And then I also like to contrast that with what we know about incarceration. So when we look at the prison population, 58% of persons incarcerated in our state and federal prisons being white, they're represented less than their representation, 72, 74%, depending on how you're counting them. Blacks, 38% of that population. But what I really like to share with them, and this is the last bit of data I think I'm going to share with you, is the rates of incarceration by race. And so, for example, in 2016, for every 100,000 white males in the population, 400 were incarcerated. For every 100,000 Latino males in the country, 1,092 were incarcerated. For every 100,000 Black males in the population in 2016, 2,400 were incarcerated. I try to put those disparities out there. And then finally, what I always do with my students, dealing with race issues, I encourage them, even though they may be a little uncomfortable with the content or with me, hang in there. You're gonna learn something. So that's my approach to the topic at hand, state-sponsored violence. I'm a criminologist who studies violent behavior. And so I tend to have a narrow understanding and interest in violence. I'm not regarding racial discrimination per se as violence. I'm not saying that you shouldn't. I'm just saying that I don't. I see it as a correlate associated with violence. I'm not describing the zero tolerance policies in schools where you have Black girls and Black boys more likely to be suspended and expelled as violence. They're associated with violence, but those policies are not violence. I'm defining violence as actual physical actions that generate physical injury up to death. But I do understand that there are many out there who have a larger sense of what constitutes violence. But for my purposes, I'm limiting violence to actual physical behavior. The definition that I'm using, and I'll be using state-sponsored violence and structural violence interchangeably. And it refers, so I'm using this definition, refers to violence that occurs in the context of dominant members of society seeking to maintain power through economic, political, and cultural means. So it's using the apparatus of the society, the apparatus of the state to maintain certain hierarchical relationships of power, dominance, submission. And there are a number of, and oftentimes there's a reliance on legitimate social or societal institutions. So the political institutions, the enactment of law to protect the interests of dominant groups, law enforcement, as well as other agencies that constitute the criminal justice system, including the courts and prisons, social media, mass media, and the educational system, just to name a few entities that are used to facilitate state-sponsored violence. I want to make a few points about the historical roots of state-sponsored violence in America. This is meant to be brief, but I want to say this. Not all state-sponsored violence is bad. Not all state-sponsored violence is bad. Whatever sort of state that we had during the colonial era, the colonial state organized itself to eliminate oppression from Britain. There was a collective action. All of our institutions, formal and informal, were involved in engaging and facilitating revolution. The Civil War. Thank God for the Civil War. As a descendant of enslaved African Americans, that the Union decided that they were not going to allow the Southern states to succeed, and later on evolved to the point of freeing the slaves. That was some, as far as I'm concerned, that was some good violence. That was some good state violence. And then, of course, America's involvement in World War II. We pat ourselves on the back often about our role in addressing Nazism and the Holocaust. So my point is, not all state-sponsored violence is bad. If we wake up tomorrow morning and the Russians are on the East Coast or on the West Coast attempting to invade, we want to see some good state violence. We want to maintain our liberty. We want to maintain our lives as we live them. So I'm arguing that not all state violence is bad, but there's some problematic state sponsored violence in America. For example, the enactment of slave codes, especially during the slavery era, which allowed for the use of violence to control and discipline slaves. If you want to read a really detailed analysis of the use of the law to maintain slavery, see the classic work, Slavery, the Peculiar Institution by Kenneth Stamp, former historian at Princeton. It's, to me, I regard it as one of the classic works on slavery. And that one chapter on the use of the law to maintain slavery and to use of the law to protect the interests of owners, as well as whites who were not owners, who had this informal authority to chastise Blacks who were running away or who had engaged in some violation of racial social etiquette during that era. The Indian Removal Act of 1830. Wow. Here's the federal government saying, we want the land of the native peoples. And we have enacted federal law that authorizes us to use the apparatus of the state to take their land. If you've not seen the documentary series on Prime Video of Trail of Tears, I encourage you to see it. Amazing, amazing what was done to take the land from these people. And those who did not voluntarily submit were subjected to state-sponsored violence. Okay. Now I want to shift to two different types of structural violence. And I get this from Aya DeCola and Shoup in their model. And they make a distinction between institutional structural violence and interpersonal structural violence. And this is detailed in my paper on cultural racism that I mentioned earlier, or in their book, but I use their framework in a more racialized context. They define institutional structural violence, institutional state-sponsored violence, as acts of violence committed by agents of the state, whether that be the state be the city governments, county government, state government, or the federal government, for the purpose of maintaining the political, economic, racial status quo. And so some examples of acts of institutional violence include things like the race and labor massacres that occurred in the early part of the 20th century in places like Tulsa, Oklahoma, that's receiving a great deal of attention right now, East St. Louis in 1917, Elaine, Arkansas in 1919, Tulsa in 1921. These were acts of violence that was involved both state actors and citizens deputized by the state to engage in acts of violence based on racial animus or desires to acquire the property or land or other resources that have been acquired by these people. Okay. And then I would also include, as part of institutional violence, violence perpetrated against protesters during the civil rights era. You've seen those photos of people being beaten or having dogs sicked on them because they were trying to eat at the lunch counter at Woolworths, or they were trying to register to vote. There's all kind of footage and documentaries about that, but that was state-supported violence. And some of these sheriffs, like Jim Clark, and some of these governors like George Wallace became famous for their resistance to allowing for the first-class citizenship of African Americans. And then interpersonal structural violence refers to acts of violence committed by individuals committed to maintaining the political economic status quo. So these are non-state actors who are engaging in acts of violence to maintain a status quo. You could argue that the Capitol insurrection was a type of interpersonal structural violence, where you have these mostly non-state actors attempting to maintain, at least maintain a particular person in the presidency. But some examples would be the KKK and some of the new groups like the Proud Boys or the Oath Keepers. And then finally, I would be remiss as a criminologist if I didn't say something about community violence. And community violence simply refers to acts of interpersonal violence that tend to occur among people who are not bonded by blood or kinship. So when we think of the more common, or what one of my professors used to call garden variety acts of violence, and assaults, aggravated assaults, murders, robbery, they would be considered community violence. And then we could also make a distinction between acts of family violence as a distinct type of interpersonal violence. Community violence is not structural, although it may be, but racial disparities in the occurrence of community violence are precipitated by structural arrangements that are problematic for people with regard to achieving a positive quality of life, if you will, that may lead to frustration, anger, and alternative means of achieving a certain stability or goals that they have in a materialistic society. Cultural racism is the ideological justification for state-sponsored structural violence. I want to say that again. Cultural racism is the ideological justification for state-sponsored violence, or what I call structural violence. Most of us are generally aware with the term institutional racism, referring to the systematic manner in which the society arranges itself to deny particular groups equal access to opportunity in terms of political involvement, education, employment, the accumulation of wealth. The civil rights movement was organized around dismantling overt institutional racism. So institutional racism has as its goal blocking access to opportunity. What we don't talk about enough in this country is cultural racism. And cultural racism seeks to denigrate the cultural identity of a particular group and to elevate the cultural identity of another group. I apologize in advance for the long definition. I used to use a short definition by a former colleague at University of Delaware, James Jones, but they let me get in academia and I got wordy. Here's the definition. The systematic manner in which the white majority as a group has established its primary cultural institutions, education, religion, mass media, to elevate and glorify European physical characteristics, character and achievement, and to denigrate and/or put down the physical characteristics, character, and achievement of non-white people. Cultural racism is about denigrating the integrity of a people. Institutional racism is about blocking access to opportunity. And what are the consequences of cultural racism? First, what are the consequences for the white majority? It produces cultural amnesia and collective denial regarding racial oppression. We've had a congressperson just say in the last couple of weeks that slavery wasn't that bad. Collect amnesia. And some of that amnesia is facilitated by what we exclude from the K through 12 social studies curriculum. I've had college students, 20, 21 years old, come to me and say, Professor Oliver, why come I've never learned about this? There's a reason. Lack of appreciation for African American, other people of color groups, lack of respect for them, and tolerance of racist, social, legal, and political practices that reinforce white dominance and the subordination of people of color. I'm saying that these are all consequences of cultural racism. Not only are whites impacted, blacks, and anyone else who lives in America is going to be exposed to some cultural racism, a sense of the racial hierarchy and who's valued and who is not. What about the consequences for African Americans? African Americans also have historical amnesia. Most African Americans have what I call 1619 knowledge. They don't know very little. They know very little about who they were before they got here. And many know very little about what our experience was like when we were here. We don't institutionalize dissemination of our story via the institutions that we control, generally speaking. So you have historical amnesia. And when you have historical amnesia, the narrative that others have about who you are begin to dominate your experience of yourself, leading to a second consequence, a lack of appreciation for African American identity and culture. Just a brief example. I was born in 1953. When I was on the school ground as a third and fourth grader, maybe in 1960, 61, if you called another black kid black or a black African, they would want to fight you. And I would say to my students, can you imagine if someone called you a white European and you beat that person up, what your parents would say when they had to go to school because you were fighting? And they said, what happened? He called me a white European and I went crazy. But black kids would go crazy if you called them black or he called them a black African. That's where you've been programmed to reject yourself. I argue that that emerges from exposure to the messaging of cultural racism. And then there's the lack of cultural confidence, leading to a lack of cultural competence. You have to believe it to achieve it. But if you accept a counter narrative of inferiority, it becomes very difficult to have cultural confidence, leading to cultural competence. And finally, a consequence of cultural racism is suspiciousness, resentment, and anger toward whites as a group that I argue many Blacks harbor and suppress because it is not safe to express anger, resentment, hostility toward white people for any injury or harm that has been done in the past. I want to move to cultural racism and police violence. What are the implications for using cultural racism as a framework to address the excessive use of force? And I want to qualify this and say this. Not all acts of violence committed against citizens, nor Black citizens, is illegitimate. We had some young people here in Indianapolis a few years ago. They went into a CVS to rob it. And when they got outside, the police were waiting for them. And they shot guns at the police, and police shot guns at them and killed them. Did the police act in a justifiable manner? Yes. If you pull a gun on me and I have a gun, I'm going to shoot my gun. I don't own a gun, but ever since Trump was president, I keep thinking I need to have a gun, but that's a whole nother issue. Police violence is rare. And according to the Police Citizens Contact Report published by the Justice Department, police have about 40 million contacts with citizens each year, and only about 2% of them, about 900,000 or so, actually result in force. The issue that emerges is that people of color and African Americans in particular are disproportionately represented among persons who die in encounters with law enforcement. However, of the 1,000, 1,100 people are killed by the police each year, a slight majority of those people are white, although Blacks are disproportionately represented. And I just want to share just one other piece of data with you just to show these racial disparities. Black males ages 15 to 19, 21 times more likely to be shot dead by the police compared to white males ages 15 to 19. So for white males 15 to 19, 1.5 per million killed by the police. For Black males, 31 per million. And I said to you earlier that the data indicates clearly that the majority of the crime is occurring among whites. So there's something about over policing in those encounters that help to give rise to that. And let's see. Okay, so I'm coming to an end, or I'm getting close. How does cultural racism contribute to racial disparities and excessive use of force? How does cultural racism contribute to racial disparities and police use of excessive force? Cultural racism, one, contributes to the development, internalization, and dissemination of racial and ethnic stereotypes. The dangerous Black man, the unruly Black woman, contributes to internalized notions of superiority for members of the majority, and it contributes to a sense of entitlement, a sense of being better than, provides justification for racial bias and ethnic discrimination. And here's a point I always like to make. One of the things that frustrates me about the police violence discussion is that reform seems to be centered on, we have to reform police organizations, and we should, we must. But the police do not pop up like toast. The police officers have experienced a certain racial socializations, as have other citizens, prior to their arrival at the police occupational role and the police organization. So I argue that many police officers import with them racial and ethnic biases into the police role, into police organizations. And that very little is done to mitigate the expression of those biases when they have the power and the authority to use force in encounters with citizens. It's just not the police organization that needs reform. Our society needs reform. And so what I'm trying to say here is that cultural racism is one of the factors that leads police to weaponize Blackness, especially among males and increasingly among females. The dangerous Black man, the dangerous Black woman, or people who are threatening to their physical well-being, and someone who must be controlled and dominated. And I also argue that encounters between white police officers and Black male citizens also becomes a boundary, or provides a context for these masculinity displays. This is the ultimate man, the dangerous Black man, the monster. He can take your life or he can be controlled. I argue that this is going on as part of the culture of policing. And then cultural racism leads to a tolerance for excessive use of force against minorities, both men and women. And just one final thing I want to leave you with, and I can talk about recommendations for reform, but I want to leave you with some findings from a study by Professor Weisburd, Weisburd, and his colleagues. They surveyed police officers, and there was two items that really stand out to me. The first was they had a statement they wanted the officers to respond to. Police treat whites better. Only 11% of the white officers agreed that police treats whites better. 47%, nearly half of the Black officers said, yes, that's true. Then, the final item I want to discuss. In the Weisburd study, they said they wanted the respondents to respond to the statement, police are more likely to use force against Blacks and other minorities. 4.5% of white officers agreed. Again, nearly 50%, 48% of black officers agreed. The black officers were 10 times more likely to express the view that police are more likely to use force against blacks and other minorities. So even in the police house, in the police family, white and black officers have different perceptions about who's treated fairly and who's not treated fairly. How am I looking on time, Professor?
Yeah, about 2 more minutes or 3.
Okay, I'll take 2. Just a brief outline on overcoming cultural racism. This is not exhaustive. I advocate for the inclusion of multicultural studies within the K through 12 social studies curricula. We have to move away from his story to the collective our story. What do we know about the Native Americans, really? What do we know about the Japanese and the Chinese who came here in the 1800s? What do we really know about African Americans and their challenges and their achievements? And if we knew more about their achievements and their challenges, that might help to counteract some of the biases that one is exposed to within the larger society about these groups being innately inferior. I also call for increasing the availability of anti-racist parenting workshops. How to raise a non-racist, because there are a lot of racist messages in the society. So you might need a little help with that, because even though you may be doing a good job in your house, your child has to go outside the house and they are exposed to messaging that could contribute to racially biased attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors. Rejecting the trend toward color blindness. Tim Wise, the great cultural educator, talks about this in his work. Over the course of the past 20 years, and especially when President Obama was the president, we wanted to believe that we're a colorblind society. No, I'm not supporting being colorblind. If you see me and you say, I don't see race, you know what I'll say to you? You don't see me. You don't know me. You don't know my history, my culture, my experiences. I want people to be color sensitive, that we've had different experiences. And then, just as a good criminal justice professor, we need to have accountability in policing. And one of the ways we can do that is to have organizational incentives for behavior that contributes to improving relations between police and minority citizens. And we need to have penalties and punishments, including loss of employment for those individuals who engage in problematic behavior. In the criminal justice world, we talk about constitutional policing, where fundamental to your professionalism as a police officer is the respect for the constitutional rights of citizens. And, you know, when I do training with police officers, I say, my goal here today is not to change your attitude toward people of color. Just be a professional when you interact with people of color. And you can be a racist when you go home. I'm okay with that. And then finally, increasing the number of minorities and women. We found that when you increase the number of minorities and women in law enforcement agencies, there's lower rates of excessive use of force complaints. I want to end with this. We need to talk to our students more about cultural racism. Those values, norms, practices that promote superiority and also promote inferiority. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that wonderful talk, and we will get to questions and answer sessions after our next presentation. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Ayana, excuse me, and we will have her present. And Ayana, I'll also give you a 3-minute warning in case you go over.
Thank you. And thank you, Dr. Oliver. That was great. That's going to be very tough to follow. But I would just like to give you a little bit of background about me and kind of like where I'm coming from. So I'm more, I would say, coming from an abolitionist of police background versus a reforming police. I grew up in the Bay Area, specifically Oakland, California. So in high school and even some in middle school, I was exposed to like the Black Panther Party and their principles and their, programmatic thrust. So just coming from that background and that standpoint, learning very early on, what was going on in my community and the ways that my ancestors and those who came before me had combated that is, from a very direct abolitionist standpoint. But just a little bit to explain my research and how I study state-sanctioned violence and structural violence. I want to start off by just briefly talking about Breonna Taylor and her being a 26-year-old, emergency EMT tech coming from Louisville, in the South. And one day officers entered her home and fired in plain clothes, police officers in plain clothes, fired 32 shots in her apartment, 6 of them hitting Breonna Taylor and killing her. And this is just one of many tragic stories of Black women who experience police violence. And it goes without what I think is justice and real repercussions. So just a couple of statistics: Black women compose of about 7%, 6.5% of the overall US population, but they're over 28% of the unarmed killings of police. And while it is clear and evident that police violence is happening constantly to Black men, I often hear stories about Black women who have direct instances of physical, sexual, psychological, emotional acts of violence towards them from police officers. And it goes unnoticed and unaddressed by not only police departments, but even themselves internally. So my research wants to bring to the forefront or the significance of these Black women's experiences, as well as how they are continuing to get more politically involved because of these direct acts of violence towards them, as well as indirect acts of violence towards them and their loved ones. I would like to say that coming into this work, I also had experienced indirect acts of violence from family members and friends who were beaten and murdered by police officers constantly, and are coming from a community that is over-policed, over-surveilled, et cetera. So I was coming into this project as a person who hadn't experienced direct violence, but proximal contact with police. So my research deals with both of those factions of state-sanctioned violence, whether it be direct or indirect. And I would just like to give a brief definition of how I'm using violence and my research, as well as, and then I'll go into the framework that I'm using. So for the purposes of my study, violence in general has to do with physical, mental, and emotional exploitation that can be both physical and psychological harm to an individual. Right. So there's what I've just mentioned, proximal contact, which is indirect, your family members, friends, loved ones who have experienced these types of violence, whether it be physical, verbal, harassment, racial profiling, etc. Or whether it's direct, where you yourself, or as a Black woman, have experienced these things. So I argue that these indirect and direct encounters with police violence lead Black women to become more mobilized, either whether it's because they feel themselves being attacked, or their loved ones continue to be attacked, and they need to protect and provide for their community as a way of survival of Black people as a whole. And using a framework of Black feminist consciousness brought on by scholars like Patricia Hill Collins and Evelyn Simeon, I define that as a mediator for Black police violence and political participation for Black women. So because of their low positionality within both racial and gender hierarchies, Black women have a greater sense of connection to one another, or a linked fate, as Dawson would say, to their racial and gendered group, which is Black women. So these experiences that I'm discussing of direct violence as well as indirect violence cause Black women to feel more of a need, again, to speak out and be vocal against the oppressions that their communities are facing. And again, this is out of an act of survival and a need to, continue the Black community and Black populations, right? So a little bit of like background or historical foundations for this. Black women not only have worked in white homes since the antebellum period and during slavery, but they also have been a matriarch for their own families and taking care of not only others but themselves. So this is an innate sort of social capital, I guess you'd say, that Black women have possessed for a very long time. And even though scholars have mentioned that, Black women who experience these constant acts of violence can be repressed from political participation, we find that Black women they come out in droves when it comes to voting, as well as getting people registered to vote. So we saw with Stacey Abrams in Georgia how the state of Georgia, for the gubernatorial race, had brought over 800,000 Black Americans out to vote, compared to the 2016 presidential election, which was also monumental, 200,000 Black Americans. And Black women, I would say, were, the driving force for that increase in political participation. So Black women have always been influential in politics, even when they couldn't do certain things. So I say that to just connect where I'm coming from with police violence, even though scholars in political science have said that it represses or acts of violence in contact with the criminal justice state have repressed Black women's or Black people's political participation, we see that that's not the case for Black women, because they have always participated traditionally and non-traditionally in starting organizations, and et cetera. So for my research and my hypotheses, I'm looking at looking at a nationally representative sample. So Black women from all over the United States, and surveying them to see if what I'm arguing about, this Black feminist consciousness and this connection or ties to one another, has to do more with them coming out to participate and mobilizing against police violence to either help their community as a whole and Black people, or to help themselves. And so we know about like the Combahee River Collective, who identified that the need for Black women to have their own sense of identity, and their and to continue to bolster their community, but not be silenced by other organizations during the civil rights movement, as well as feminist organizations during that time. So that my research kind of specifically wants to address just this piece of Black women and their feminist consciousness, right? Also, the piece about mobilizing through, is it the direct violence that's mobilizing women, or is that repressing their political participation, or is the indirect violence and their family members and loved ones and Black men being overly exposed to police? Is this what's causing them to go out and participate politically? And are they participating more traditionally because of this, or are they participating more non-traditionally? And I'll give a brief definition of what I mean by traditional versus non-traditional. So traditional politics for political scientists are usually, going out to vote, lobbying for a certain politician to win, donating to a campaign, things of that nature. Whereas non-traditional forms can include volunteering or protesting a certain issue that you find a grievance with, right? So Black women, again, have always engaged with both of these forms of political participation. But my research is looking at what is police violence or these acts a driving force for either or happening. So scholars like Jewel Prestige, et cetera, have always looked at non-traditional forms of Black women voting because, again, they weren't able to do so in previously. So this identification of what it means to be politically active and how it is to be politically active is important in identifying. So also, political scientists generally have devoted significant attention to identifying, other factors of influence for Black people in their voting. However, I theorize that the presence of being in communities that are over-surveilled and over-policed has a significant psychological effect on Black women that leads them to participate in a more robust way than other communities. So using an intersectional framework, racial and economic inequalities that impact individuals need to be taken into account when looking at political participation. And this is not necessarily done in political science. So the theories that have come before don't use, all the same. They generally talk about Black women who are in political office or who come from a certain socioeconomic status. So Black women who tend to be poor or tend to be less educated are not seen in the data the way we see other Black women groups. So also making sure that Black women are not seen as a monolith is important for this research, because there's so many different factions of what Blackness means and what it means when interacting with police violence and when interacting with the state. So while women encounter high levels of violence in various forms, Black women, again, tend to be overexposed to these acts of violence due to their positionality. And according to a historian, Dana Berry, she used the term misogynoir, and this term was coined by Moya Bailey, but it is a term used to describe gendered anti-Black violence, ranging from police beatings and murders of unarmed Black women to racist targeting of leading to Black female scholars, attorneys, journalists, and political figures. So this violence is in addition to the ongoing disparities in Black women's access to both education, healthcare, employment, housing, etc. And again, this is all, in my definition, a psychological violence and the structural issues that deal with racism and sexism in America are causing a psychological impact to Black women, which is also causing them to politicize themselves in different ways than we would see traditionally, or that what we would see from their Black male counterparts. So there are many ways that political scientists, more specifically, because that's the field I come from, but political scientists more specifically study Black women, again, or Black people in general, using like general terms as just using race as like a dummy variable and quantitative methods, and not really getting into the qualitative piece of their actual experiences and what's happening when we talk about these disparities in this misogynoir. So my research hopes to also take interviews of Black women from the community, from all socioeconomic statuses, from all education levels, from all income levels, from different places, whether it be the rural South or the North or California, et cetera, and really ask these questions like, do you feel, number one, do you feel a sense of a Black feminist consciousness or a group consciousness, as Gay and Tate would say, this, this strong identity or need for, first and foremost, a Black consciousness, but then as well as a Black feminist consciousness. And then asking them, do you feel that police violence really even is an issue for you directly or indirectly? And how will you combat this? So gauging those experiences in a qualitative way, what I believe will give me more of a in-depth and nuanced experience and give me a better breadth of data than that is already available to the field of political science, as well as sociology and psychology of Black Americans. So Professor Oliver discussed a little bit about how these police officers come from or bring in these racial biases, even when, they're coming into the police force. And I definitely find this to be 100% true. They also bring sexist and gendered biases into the police force with them as well. So the literature on police force, or the use of excessive force, reports that the percentage of police shootings involving Black victims exceeds, the percentage of Blacks in the population by like 200%. Right. So there's early literature where police are surveyed, and this showed that there are what police call what Bender and Schaaf call two belief perspectives about why Blacks were disproportionately killed by the police in certain neighborhoods. And the first belief perspective of police shooting rates involved in internal structural policies and practices that actually trained officers to use more violence when dealing with Black people. And this comes from a long history of fear of specifically the Black male. And when we talk about the Black woman, we have this angry Black woman, or this man, these different stereotypes about what Black women are that lead to these racial and gendered biases that are innate within the training of police officers. Then we have a second belief perspective that argued that the killing of Black people was justified because they disproportionately were involved in crime. And as Dr. Oliver stated, we know that that's not the case. They're just disproportionately policed, and their communities are disproportionately policed. So they are getting overly arrested for certain crimes, whereas their white counterparts would not even be on the radar of certain police officers. So current theories show there is a clear racial bias in law enforcement, and there are these hidden curriculums within the police academy and the trainings that promote hypermasculinity and patriarchy. So the literature around police departments and norms in police departments continue to have these unspoken rules, or this misogynistic and racist culture, while in the field that leads to both implicit and explicit biases when dealing with Black people, and specifically Black women. So there's also been theories about the differential treatment of Black women when it comes to this community violence and interpersonal violence, that when we talk about domestic violence or rape cases, or calling for Black women calling for police officers. Black women often run the risk of experiencing more violence when they call the police for assistance and to report, domestic violence issues or rape issues. And they have reported, but it's underreported, experiences of harassment and physical assault of police when they're called. So there is a study done by Walker and Ehrbeck that discusses driving while female, and women who have tried to report these instances of violence and have been met with more sexual violence. So we have cases in Oklahoma where a police officer was charged with raping and assaulting Black women specifically for a long period of time. We also have an instance in Baltimore where Black women specifically were asked to strip search. They were strip searched and reported being sexually assaulted in their encounters with dealing with police. So I want my research to have an overall sense of what violence is, and how gendered violence for Black women specifically looks totally different and includes so many different nuances to other communities their Black male counterparts, as well as their other women of color within the American system. But I say all this to say I want to lay out like what I mean in the different types of violence. But again, these seem to be politically emboldening Black women. So even though they are subjugated, they still are resisting, and they always have resisted. And I want to keep that in mind. So Black women are powerful change agents in their communities, and they always have been in the forefront of their community collectively, even though they haven't received the same attention, or their voices haven't been heard the same way as Black men and generally white women. But Black women share a unique bond and a unique experience with these different instances of violence, and of state-sanctioned violence, more specifically, that goes way back again to the antebellum period. So a number of Black women, including Samir Rice, who was Tamir Rice's mother, have become politically engaged and even ran for office through their experiences with police violence. So a lot of my theory is coming from seeing Black women, or who have experienced community violence, interpersonal violence, who have been emboldened within their community to run for office, to do grassroots mobilizing campaigns, et cetera, through the violence they've experienced with their, not only with themselves, but with their loved ones. And I think the loved ones piece is just as important, if not more important, than the direct violence to Black women, because we're so community oriented, and we have this matriarchal history even from the antebellum period again. So again, this project works through a intersectional framework, and as well as using this Black feminist consciousness as the mediator for this violence and their political participation. And I kind of just want to leave with a few takeaways that I've got from gauging this research. So again, Black women are large change agents in their own community, as well as in the broader community, being one of the largest, if not the second largest voting bloc in the United States. And they're acting or they're politicizing and mobilizing because of the instances or the experiences that they are facing. And unfortunately, police violence or state-sanctioned violence, as well as other types of violence, community violence and interpersonal violence, are plaguing their community so much that they have to speak out against what's going on as a means of survival. So their participation, looking at ways to combat their subjugated class and gendered hierarchy in the United States, is going to be key in solving these issues of violence towards Black women. Also gauging, through survey research and public opinion research, Black women do feel that they need to protect their communities, and Black men specifically, sometimes over themselves. Now, I don't know if this is considered a good thing or, something that we need to, I guess, work on, but it's important to note that Black women are experiencing this kind of putting themselves in the background when they could be talking more about their issues. So yeah, I will leave it there, and thank you, and I'm here for questions.
Oh, thank you so much to both of our webinar presenters. We will have time now for a question and answer session. And if you want to, you can ask a question via Zoom, or you can put it in the chat box and I will ask the question. So I'll go ahead and get started because I did have a question asked by Dr. Strenio, who had to leave early, sadly. And she said her question to both would be about what is the role for economists here? So what would you like to see from economists in order to address these issues?
That's that's difficult for me because I don't completely understand what economists do. But I think superficially, or maybe that's the wrong word, but one thing that economists could do is talk about begin to examine the economic cost associated with police use of excessive force. For example, there's been some research that has just looked at the liability judgments or civil damage judgments that have been paid out by cities as a result of officers being found responsible for wrongful death or engaging in excessive force. So on the surface, I can see, and what I would like to know more about, and I think an economist could help with this, what is the full range of economic cost associated with state-sponsored violence? That's pretty much what I would have to say about that. And in the literature, other than the amount of money paid out for civil damages, you don't see very much additional discussion as it relates to economic costs. Oh, there's another economic cost that's sometimes discussed, and that is when cities have civil unrest in response to excessive use of force that can impact tourism as well.
I would definitely agree with Dr. Oliver in assessing how much is really spent on state-sanctioned violence. We know that each city or major cities across the United States, when acts of police violence or police brutality happen towards the families, they have to pay out millions of dollars in civil lawsuits. They're also paying out, millions of dollars just for police budgets. So understanding all the different facets of what it costs to have all this violence going on in communities, because it's also costing, taxpayers. So I think if an economist can assess like how much are we really spending as a nation on police violence, that would be important, and that would also shift the narrative and like we need to do something about this because you're spending too much of my tax money to kill people.
So I see we have a question. Amitava, is that how you say your name?
Yes.
Sorry. Okay.
Yes, just one quick comment on the question and the answer about what economists can do. I think we should all go away from the usual understanding of what we economists. I don't know what we economists are, and I hope it is not simply a matter of monetizing the value of loss. Okay, so I think that this idea of what we economists can do is a misguided question because it's not even clear what that means. I don't want to criticize. I don't know who asked that question, but it leads to answers of this kind. Anyway, that's just a comment. My question, first of all, thank you very, very much, Dr. Oliver and soon to be Dr. Best, for your very interesting and thoughtful presentations. I have many questions, but let me ask just two questions to the two of you for equal opportunity. one question to Dr. Oliver is your distinction between justified, I forget what word he used, violence versus unjustified violence. And I agree that in principle, a distinction like this can exist. But when you come to looking at a specific incident and trying to decide which one it is a much more complex matter. And let, let me just mention what I mean by this. Well, if the Russians were to attack us, okay, uh,
Yes, sir.
thinking along things in this kind of nationalist lines, I don't think is terribly useful, okay? Or let's go and kill the Vietnamese, okay, for the sake of the country. Uh, your case of somebody robbing a grocery store and coming out, if he points a gun at me, I will do that. Police can shoot somebody's feet rather than somebody's heart. Okay, so and also this notion that people are vandalizing stores. Very often vandalization occurs by state or quasi-state organizations putting in people in otherwise peaceful protests to cause violence. And then anyway, these are more complicated issues. So I was wondering if you can comment on this a little bit. I mean, my general presumption is violence in general is never justified unless one can have very strong arguments to go to the other side. Uh, uh, I'm sorry I'm taking so long, but I wanted to clarify what I meant. Soon to be Dr. Best. I entirely agree with you about both this intersectionality issue that needs to be looked at, but also your doubts about quantitative research. But I'm sure you're aware also about and the problems with qualitative questions about how to interpret what is said, like, do you have woman's consciousness? I don't know if anybody understands what that means, right? Or how do you feel, right? So um, I think quantitative research with dummy variables or whatever are sometimes complete nonsense. But qualitative research also has to be taken with due cynicism. And since both of you are here, intersectionality, I'd like to hear Dr. Oliver's suggestion, perhaps, that you're dividing blacks into men and women, and what does that mean? I think intersectionality is a very important issue, but I wonder what it means for dividing groups. Sorry, yeah, for taking so long.
Professor, there is so much to unpack in your statement and in your questions, and I'll just try to address a couple of things. As a result of Supreme Court case law, when officers are charged with a crime that involves excessive use of force, you may have saw a little bit of this if you watched the hearing for Officer Chauvin, who was convicted of killing George Floyd. And at the Supreme Court level, the courts, and even at the lower courts, when there's going through a trial, they use the standard of reasonableness. What would a reasonable officer do under the circumstances as it relates to the use of force? Where you and I disagree is there's I can't remember the exact cases. I think it's Tennessee versus Garner. You can look that up. Tennessee versus Garner, the Supreme Court established the rules for the use of excessive force, where an officer is protecting his own life or engaging in acts of fatal violence to protect others. Where you and I disagree is that I think that there are circumstances in which the police as state actors who have been granted this discretionary power and authority to use force should be able to use force and even deadly force. I'm not opposed to the use of deadly force if it is reasonable, and then that becomes the sort of slippery slope. What constitutes reasonableness? So that's one point. I can't remember everything you said. On the issue of, you mentioned something about dividing this issue by gender. One of the things that I derived from Ayana's discussion is that there's been for a decade or so an increasing interest in highlighting issues, social challenges that are specific to Black girls and Black women. You see this with regard to suspension and expulsion from school. You see it with regard to increasing interest in acts of community violence involving Black girls and women. What I derived from Ayana's discussion was that Black women, I see a connection between Black women being at the forefront of addressing police violence and Black women being at the forefront of the civil rights movement, where they played equally important roles. And I would argue that with regard to the, say, Black Lives Matter movement, Black women have been more in the forefront of that movement than any other movement that I can think of, or at least they've got credit. Whereas in the past, they didn't receive the credit that they, and that may have had a lot to do with just gender bias in terms of how both men and women perceive leadership, especially in the past. And I think we're moving into a new era now for all communities with regard to being able to see women as the leader or definitely among the leadership group. And I'll leave it there on that point. There was a couple of other points you made. I know you're a professor because only professors can ask so many questions within one statement, but I'll leave it there.
Perhaps we can be in touch by email.
Yes, sir.
If it's okay with you. Yeah.
Yes, I would love that.
I will briefly comment on the first, the qualitative versus quantitative question, and then the intersectional research question. So I consider myself to be a mixed method scholar, using both quantitative and qualitative research, because again, like you said, like a lot of the, especially in political science, they just throw a race variable in there as a dummy variable. And that just perturbs me because it's like, you can't just measure any group of people who have lived experiences in this way. You can't tease out the nuances. You can't understand what's really going on with just a number. So while I do think that these numbers do something for the data and for the research, the qualitative research really bolsters those experiences and the actual viewpoint of people who are living in these situations. So I don't necessarily think you can have one without the other. As a mixed method scholar, I think you need them both to have a a breadth of knowledge on a certain theory or a certain phenomena happening. And I use them both. And again, I do have this issue with how, interview participants interpret certain things that I'm saying or questions that I'm asking them. Are they interpreting them the way I want them to necessarily interpret them? Is a problem. So I'm learning and reading and figuring out, the correct ways to ask certain questions, the correct ways to code what people are saying, using the other factors that may come about when interviewing someone, and their, personal biases or whatever the case may be, are all important. So yes, on that question. And then the question about kind of separating the sexes, or this has been an issue again since the abolitionist movement, when Sojourner Truth was talking to Frederick Douglass, or however the case may be, about the issue of, is it a Black people issue, or is it a specific Black woman or Black male issue. And then when it comes to the civil rights movement, again, we were at the forefront of that movement in a lot of ways. In the Black Lives Matter movement, it was founded by 3 Black women who thankfully are receiving a lot more credit than the women who were involved in SNCC, or the SL, the Southern Leadership Conference. But it's still, again, there was a need for us to say her name, because we weren't in the conversations the way we should have been. They weren't talking about sexual acts of violence that were happening against Black women constantly, and have been happening for decades in these conversations against police. So, and again, in my research, I talk about how Black women are tied to their communities. There's in this Black feminist consciousness, there's not a real way to separate Black women from their experiences with their community and their loved ones. So I think that's important to note, that even though Black women are in the forefront, they're still fighting for their communities. They're still fighting for Black males. But they also have to draw attention to what's going on with them, or they will get left behind, if that makes sense.
Can I just ask
Thank
the
you.
brief? I'm sorry to interrupt you, Professor. Can I just ask the brief question, Ayana, is related to the question? And I think I heard you say that in your research, you want to see whether or not there's a distinction between the responses of women who manifest a Black feminist consciousness and those who do not. And so I want to ask you whether or not Professor Patricia Hill Collins or others have developed any measures or indexes to uncover or make a distinction between women who manifest Black feminist consciousness and those who do not. And if they have not, whether or not there's other research involving women in general that allows you to quantitatively or qualitatively uncover a a feminist consciousness. I'm just curious, because it seems to me that's going to be important, even if you have to develop an index yourself in the analysis of your data. And now I'll let you respond.
Yes, thank you. That's something that I'm actually grappling with now in the research. Is there a Black feminist consciousness for Black women that focuses primarily on Black women, or is there a Black feminist consciousness for Black women that is focusing on the community as a whole, or is that just Black consciousness? And Evelyn Simeon starts to create this, I guess, measurement that political scientists can use. But there is no, that I have found yet, in-depth index or way of measuring the nuances of Black feminist consciousness. And I think that's something that I'm working with and teasing out to try to create on my own, and using Patricia Hill Collins' work, Evelyn Simeon's work, Dr. Gay and Tate's work, et cetera, to kind of figure out those pieces.
If I were on your committee, I would require you to develop an index.
Okay. Duly noted.
All right, well, thank you so much for that discussion. I do want to apologize a little, because I think I misinterpreted the question from my colleague a little differently. When we talked about economist, the role, she does mean it in perspective of disciplinary research and in perspective of what can an economist's unique training and perspective provide to this issue. So just wanted to clarify that aspect of things. I just reached out to her and touched base. So Caroline, I see your hand is up. So would you like to ask a question?
Yeah, hi everyone. Greetings. I'm in Toronto and this is my office, my car, because my house is a bit of a zoo with you know, the homeschooling and what have you. So this is a way that I could focus on your talks for a long period of time. I wanted to say thank you for coming out to ASE and sharing your wealth of knowledge with us. I definitely take this as a master class. I have no expertise in anything of state violence, but I look at more structural violence that's happening when I study provisioning. So I want to thank you both for coming here today. I'm going to start, this time I'm going to flip it and I'm going to start with Ayana Best, if that's okay. Ayana, I really appreciated your talk. I'm glad that there is someone focusing on violence as it pertains to African American women. So often in time, men are taking you know, priority often on the lives that are lost. So I'm happy about the whole movement of Say Her Name. So I thank you for bringing that work forward. I also recognize that you're one of few people that are in political science looking at these kinds of issues. My interest for you would be, and it kind of is of late, I don't know if you're reading Akele Mbembe and Femi Taiwo. They're both really important philosophers at this time. They have a really great conversation. I think it was in a piece with the Jacobin, but it's talking about state violence and coercion and sort of what comes after the mess. I mean, it's one thing to denote Code Noir and all these kind of atrocities that happen to Black people, but we need to take that further, and that conversation is really useful. So if you're looking at theory and ideas on where do we go, how do we co-opt systems, larger sort of economic, social systems, so that they can be more responsive to the harms that are happening, particularly to Black people, might be a useful conversation. But Ayana, my question to you is, because I heard pieces of it coming through, that there's trauma, there's resistance. Political science often makes assumptions that Black women's engagement in civil society is limited when there's kind of a hostile environment. And you're pushing back against that. I can hear it, but I'd like you to speak to sort of the outcomes of Black women sort of strategy in informal collective organizing, because I do actually think that that has real relevance to the study of social economics and political economics. And I'd like to hear, you know, you speak to sort of the informal collective groups that have really taken a national stage, maybe highlight one group and how that could actually sort of counter some of the trauma that Black people are facing. And then to you, Dr. Oliver, I tend to use the term institutional racism, looking at it as a way to put down, silence, erase, deny opportunity, and what have you. So you've introduced me to this idea of cultural racism that I have to think about. And I'd like a resource. If you can point me in the direction of resources, that could be useful.
Okay. I would like you to point you to resources via email. Okay.
Oh, okay. Yes, sure.
I would love those resources as well.
Okay.
But let me see if I'm gauging all the parts of your question. So speaking toward, you would like me to speak more towards the informal collective groups and how this is contributing to
So sort of, I guess my question, sorry for not being clear for you. So in response to the trauma that Black women are experiencing, whether they're engaging with grief, loss, or personal trauma themselves as a direct result of state violence, how are they as a group coming together as a cohesive group unit to address issues of, you know, social, all kinds of things like social provisioning, the rights of mothers who've lost children, or, you know, all kinds of varied ways. I mean, we know of Black Lives Matter, but I'm interested in hearing, is there going to be a focus, other than just detailing the traumas that happen to people? Sort of, I keep saying that there's this fetish now of Black suffering on display, but I would also like to see what is happening in response to that. What is community doing, and what have they always been doing to counter that kind of abuse?
Yes, sorry. So that's thank you for that question. I wanted to, so, you know, there are a number of organizations that have been doing work, you know, previously, before even before Black Lives Matter, on instances of police violence in the community. I think when I was, you know, starting this research, I was thinking about both Tamir Rice's mother, as well as Trayvon Martin's parents, who had been politically emboldened with the acts that happened towards their sons, and Mothers Against Police Brutality, which is a organization that started for women, but primarily for the founders are Black women who, you know, are giving new voice to providing justice for mothers who have lost their children. And also just Black women from a direct standpoint who have been speaking out more and starting collectives who have experienced both sexual and physical violence from police, where before this was kind of like a taboo issue and we didn't hear about it. We're starting to hear about it, even with the Daniel Holtzclaw in Oklahoma, with this case where women are coming forward and saying like, this happened to me, and despite the repercussions that I may face, like I want to come out and speak about it, and more Black women are coming out saying, I've had this same or similar experience. So I think this is something that is Black women have again always done and always mobilized and organized in different ways. But I think we're seeing something new with the increased media attention to, you know, the Black Lives Matter movement and Say Her Name, and the social media platforms, I think, are now going to be different. So I think this is kind of like, hopefully, where I can be you know, provide a contribution with my research in looking at the new ways that Black women are mobilizing, organizing, and forming these new groups. So just with the interview questions, I hope to really gauge that, and with the qualitative research, I hope to gauge like what are you doing in your community, or how do you feel that what are the needs and resources that you would like to see to better engage with police violence in your communities. So that'll be important to tease out, especially when I create this index that Dr. Oliver is discussing. I'll be able to really measure, you know, what's happening for Black women.
Thank you. And so part of why I'm asking that question, and I'm glad Amitabh pushed back at the first question a little bit, because I see a lot of that opening, that sort of alternative or that pushback against brutality as being very much part of what I call the solidarity economy. And I think that there's a lot of space in social economics for the kinds of work that you're looking at, just going beyond only focused on the trauma, but also looking at sort of the informal collective organizing that really inform what we mean or understand by the social economy. So thank you.
All right, well, any other questions? I know we're at time right now, but again, I just cannot thank both of our panelists so much for participating. Your presentations were both so wonderful. And actually, we do have one more raised hand. So, Olivia, do you have a question?
Yeah, I'll try and be quick. I just wondered, in their personal studies or research just in general on this matter, if either of you feel like poverty is neglected in these studies, or just quantitatively, what your thoughts are on that.
I definitely think that lower class is an issue when addressing a lot of the studies that we see in research. And that was one of the things I wanted to tease out when getting a nationally representative sample of interview participants as well as survey participants with my research, to kind of show that, again, Black people are not a monolith, and Black women are not a monolith. And they are, while they're, very educated, they still are experiencing poverty at alarming rates, more than any other, gender demographic group. So I definitely think it's important, and it's something that I'm raising in the research.
All right. Well, thank you again so much. And we look forward to the next session, if you can make it. Look forward to hearing more about these very important issues. So hope everyone has a great rest of your afternoon. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. It was great.
Thanks very